At 9 a.m. on the 15th of October 1849, a wagon train of 300 people departed from the banks of the Jordan River near modern-day Salt Lake City. They were called the Sand Walking Party. They carried provisions for 6 months. Their destination was the gold fields of California. Everything seemed hopeful. The route they chose was a new shortcut that promised to shave 500 miles off the journey. Only a few days later, something was off. By October 17th, the wagons had entered the Great Salt Lake Desert. The ground was hard and cracked. The scouts reported that the water holes they had been told about were dry. No one turned back. On October 19th, the first ox collapsed from thirst. By October 21st, the party had covered only 35 miles. Their guide, a man named Lewis Manley, insisted the route was correct. He pointed to a distant mountain range and said the Humboldt River lay just beyond. On October 23rd, 2 more animals died. The party began rationing water. On October 25th, a group of men rode ahead to search for water. They returned on October 27th with no news. The river did not appear. November 1st, the party reached a spring. The water was alkaline, bitter, and barely drinkable. They stayed for 2 days. On November 3rd, they moved on. The wagons grew lighter as families abandoned furniture, trunks, and personal belongings. On November 5th, they entered a narrow canyon. The sides rose steeply. The road, if it could be called a road, was no more than a trace of dust and broken stones. By November 7th, they had lost 20 oxen. By November 10th, the first baby died. The burial was marked with a pile of stones. On November 12th, the party split into 2 groups. The stronger men walked ahead to find help. The women, children, and weaker men stayed behind with the remaining wagons. They agreed to meet at a landmark known as the Mountain of the Snow. On November 15th, the faster group climbed a ridge. Below them lay a vast basin of white salt flats and barren mountains. There was no river, there was no grass, there was no road. They had taken a shortcut that did not exist. The guide, Lewis Manley, later admitted that he had never traveled this route before. He had only heard about it from a trader at Salt Lake City. No one had verified the path. No official survey had been conducted. The system of travel in 1849 was built on hearsay, optimism, and desperation. On November 18th, a snowstorm hit the basin. Temperatures dropped below freezing. The slower group ran out of food. On November 22nd, they killed the last ox. On November 26th, they ate the leather from the wagon seats. On December 1st, 2 men went insane from thirst and wandered into the desert. They were never seen again. On December 5th, the faster group reached a canyon with a small stream. They sent a messenger back to the slower group with directions. The messenger became lost and died. On December 10th, the slower group found the stream, but it was already frozen. They melted snow in their hands. On December 15th, a lone rider appeared. He was a young man named William Manley, unrelated to the guide, but part of a separate party that had also taken this cutoff. He brought news that a rescue party was being organized from the settlements in Southern California, but the rescue party was still 200 miles away. On December 20th, the group decided to abandon the wagons. They packed what they could carry and started walking. On December 23rd, they crossed the summit of a range now called the Panamint Mountains. Below them lay a desert valley so hot and dry that later maps would label it Death Valley. They did not know that name yet. They only knew they had to cross it. On December 25th, Christmas Day, they reached the valley floor. The temperature climbed to 90 degrees. They had no water. On December 26th, the first adult died. On December 27th, the group found a spring, but it was nearly dry. On December 28th, a man named John Breyer collapsed and could not rise. His wife and children stayed with him. The rest moved on. On January 1st, 1850, the survivors of the Sand Walking Party stumbled into a mining camp near present-day Los Angeles. They were skeletal, burned by the sun, and barely conscious. Of the 300 people who had left Salt Lake City in October, only 97 made it out. The rest had died on a road that did not exist. What happened? The Sand Walking Party was one of dozens of wagon trains that took unverified cutoffs during the California gold rush. The gold discovery in January 1848 had set off a global stampede. By 1849, over 90,000 people were moving west. The established routes like the Oregon Trail and the California Trail were overcrowded and slow. Travelers were willing to try anything that promised speed. Enterprising guides, mapmakers, and traders began promoting shortcuts. Some were genuine, most were not. The road system across the American West in 1849 was not a system at all. It was a patchwork of Indian trails, fur trapper paths, and wagon tracks that had never been surveyed, graded, or maintained. No federal agency oversaw construction. No standards existed for width, drainage, or crossings. A road could be a rut in the dirt or a notch blasted out of granite. The Sand Walking Party relied on a single guide who had no first-hand knowledge of the terrain. He carried a hand-drawn map that later investigators found to be sketched on the back of an envelope. The map showed a river at the foot of a mountain that did not exist. When historians reconstructed the journey in the early 20th century, they found that the party had missed the actual turnoff to the Humboldt River by a margin of 12 miles. They had chosen a canyon that led into a dead end. The missed signal was subtle, a fork in the trail that looked like the main route but was not. No signs marked the correct path. No checkpoints existed to warn travelers. The system had no redundancy. Who was involved? Beside the guide Lewis Manley, there were several experienced mountain men in the party who argued against the cutoff. They had been to California before. They knew the desert. They warned that the water holes shown on the map were seasonal at best. Their warnings were overruled by the majority who wanted to save time. The party elected a leader who sided with the guide. The decision to ignore the dissenters was a failure of group judgment under pressure. That failure was repeated across the entire frontier during the Gold Rush era. Thousands of people died on roads that existed only on paper. What investigators found later, when the Bureau of Indian Affairs and later the Army Corps of Topographical Engineers mapped the region, was a pattern. The shortcut that killed the Sand Walking Party was one of dozens of so-called cutoffs that led to disaster. The mapmakers who created these routes often had never set foot on them. They drew them based on second-hand accounts, sometimes from Native American informants, sometimes from drunk miners. One map from 1849 showed a direct route from Salt Lake City to Sacramento that crossed the Sierra Nevada at a pass that did not exist. That map sold for $10 a copy and was bought by over 3,000 people. How could this have happened? Because there was no regulation. No government body reviewed maps before publication. No surveyors verified the terrain. The market for speed overruled the need for accuracy. What systems failed? The first was the lack of official road building. The federal government had funded the national road in the east, but the west was left to private enterprise. Roads were built by mining companies, local merchants, and speculators who charged tolls. They had financial incentive to claim a road existed even if it did not. The second failure was communication. There were no telegraph lines across the desert, no weather forecasts. A wagon train could leave Salt Lake City having heard no news from the trail ahead for months. By the time they realized the cutoff was a dead end, it was too late to turn back. The third failure was the absence of search and rescue. When the Sand Walking Party disappeared, no one noticed for weeks. There was no official system to track overland travelers. Rescue came only because a few survivors managed to walk out and raise the alarm. Why does this still matter? The disaster of the Sand Walking Party and many like it forced a shift in how the American West was built. The demand for reliable roads grew louder. By 1853, Congress had authorized the first transcontinental railroad surveys. By 1856, the government began funding military roads through the territories. The lessons from the Gold Rush road disasters informed the construction of the Overland Trail, the Pony Express route, and finally the Transcontinental Railroad itself. The roads that built the American West were not built quickly or safely. They were built on the bodies of those who went first. The story of the Sand Walking Party is not just about one lost wagon train. It is about the cost of speed when infrastructure is not ready. It is about the gap between what people hoped existed and what the land actually offered. In the years that followed, the road builders of the West learned to survey, to map, to grade, and to warn. But the price of that knowledge was measured in people. The bones of the Sand Walking Party still lie scattered across the basin they tried to cross. Their graves are unmarked. Their shortcut is gone. But the road that replaced it, the road that finally carried miners safely to California, was built because of what they taught the country. The road system of the American West did not emerge from careful planning. It emerged from failure, from desperation, and from the repeated realization that the land would not tolerate shortcuts. At 10 a.m. on the 12th of November, 1850, a party of 15 miners left the town of Placerville, California, bound for the Walker River region. They took a road that local traders had advertised as the Johnson Cutoff. The road was supposed to save 3 days of travel by bypassing the main route through Carson Pass. The men carried food for 2 weeks. They had a map printed in a San Francisco newspaper. The map showed a straight line through a valley that, according to the newspaper, had abundant water and grass. Within 2 days, the terrain changed. The valley narrowed into a canyon. The canyon walls rose 1,000 feet. The stream at the bottom was dry. On November 15th, the party reached a dead end. The canyon terminated in a sheer rock face. There was no pass, there was no road, there was only granite. The men turned back, but snow had already begun to fall. On November 17th, the snow was knee-deep. On November 19th, they abandoned their mules. On November 22nd, the first man died of exposure. The remaining 14 built a shelter from pine boughs. They had no food. They burned the mule packs for warmth. On November 27th, a second man died. On December 1st, a third. On December 6th, 3 men decided to walk out for help. They were never seen again. By December 15th, only 4 men were alive. They had eaten the mule meat, then the hides, then the leather of their boots. On December 20th, 2 more died. On December 24th, the last 2 survivors were found by a search party that had been sent out from Placerville after a traveler noticed the men had not returned. The search party arrived at the shelter to find 1 man alive but delirious. The other died within hours. The lone survivor, a young man named James Sullivan, was carried back to Placerville. He lost both feet to frostbite. He could never walk again. What happened? The Johnson cutoff was a fraud. It had been promoted by a land speculator named William Johnson who owned a parcel of land near the supposed route. Johnson had never traveled the entire cutoff. He had heard from a Native American informant that there might be a way through the mountains. He printed flyers and placed advertisements in the Sacramento Union. The cutoff existed only on paper. The newspaper that printed the map had not verified it. The federal government had no authority to stop the publication. The state of California had no inspection system for roads. The road network in 1850 was entirely private. Anyone could claim a route was safe. There were no standards, no signs, no rangers, no emergency services. The only way to know if a road was real was to travel it, and by the time you learned the truth, you might be dead. How could this have happened? The California gold rush had exploded the population of the state from 15,000 in 1848 to over 250,000 by 1850. The demand for transportation was overwhelming. Every week, thousands of people arrived in San Francisco and Sacramento, eager to reach the goldfields in the Sierra Nevada. The established routes like the Carson Pass and the Sonora Pass were overcrowded. Miners wanted alternatives. The market responded with maps, guidebooks, and road announcements that promised faster, easier travel. There was no legal requirement to tell the truth. Fraudulent cutoff promotion became a business. The state legislature attempted to pass a law requiring road promoters to post a bond, but the law was vetoed by the governor in 1850. The argument was that regulation would stifle economic growth, so the fraud continued. Who was involved? The victims were ordinary miners. Most were young men from the East Coast, from Europe, from China. They had little experience with mountain travel. They trusted printed maps and newspaper advertisements because they came from a world where printed material was reliable. That trust was exploited. The map makers, the newspaper editors, the land speculators, and the local politicians all played a role. The map makers rarely left their offices. The newspaper editors did not check sources. The land speculators had financial interest in attracting travelers. The politicians prioritized growth over safety. The entire system was built on the assumption that the land was empty and the market would self-correct. The land was not empty. The market did not self-correct. It corrected only when enough people died that the news spread. What systems failed? The first failure was the absence of a state or federal surveying agency for roads. The Army Corps of Topographical Engineers had mapped parts of the West, but their work was slow and focused on military objectives. They had not mapped the Sierra Nevada in detail. The second failure was the lack of a central information bureau. In 1850, there was no way for a traveler in Sacramento to check whether a cutoff was real. Word of mouth traveled slowly. By the time news of the Johnson cutoff disaster reached San Francisco, 3 weeks had passed. The third failure was the lack of rescue infrastructure. There were no mountain rescue teams, no helicopters, no radio. When the search party went out for the Johnson cutoff survivors, they spent 5 days finding the shelter. They had no maps. They relied on the memory of a man who had once passed through the area. The searchers nearly died themselves. Why does this still matter? The Johnson cutoff disaster was not an isolated incident. It was one of dozens of similar tragedies that occurred between 1849 and 1855. The cumulative effect of these disasters forced a change in how roads were built and maintained in the American West. The miners themselves began to demand better infrastructure. In 1851, a group of miners in Placerville organized a private company to build a road over Carson Pass. They raised funds by subscription and hired Chinese laborers to grade the route. The road was completed in 1850. It was the first engineered wagon road across the Sierra Nevada. It had bridges, culverts, and drainage ditches. It was maintained year-round. The road reduced the travel time from Sacramento to the Comstock lode from 2 weeks to 3 days. It was a success. Other communities followed. By 1855, the California state legislature had authorized a system of toll roads, each regulated by a charter that specified maintenance standards. The charters required road companies to post bonds and to submit maps for approval. The era of fraudulent cutoffs was ending. But the lessons from the Johnson cutoff and the Sand Walking Party extended beyond the Sierra Nevada. The same pattern repeated in the Great Basin, the Rocky Mountains, and the Pacific Northwest. The federal government, watching the death toll climb, began to invest in infrastructure. In 1853, the Pacific Railroad surveys began. These were systematic expeditions to map potential routes for a transcontinental railroad. The surveys employed engineers, geologists, and botanists. They collected data on climate, terrain, and resources. They produced detailed maps that were published and distributed. The surveys did not just find railroad routes. They also identified safe wagon roads. They located water sources. They marked passes. They created a baseline of geographic knowledge that had been absent during the gold rush. The timing was critical. By 1857, the United States was on the brink of the Civil War. The federal government needed a reliable supply route to its military posts in the West. The Army Corps of Topographical Engineers was tasked with building a military wagon road from Fort Kearny, Nebraska to Fort Laramie, Wyoming, and beyond to the Oregon Trail. The road was built to military specifications, a minimum width of 12 feet, no grade steeper than 4%, and a clear passing lane every half mile. The road was completed in 1858. It was the first road in the American West that was designed, surveyed, and built by a federal agency. It set a standard that would be used for decades. The impact of these roads was immediate and profound. The engineered roads reduced the cost of moving goods from the Missouri River to California from $400 per ton to $150 per ton. They allowed the Pony Express to operate. They enabled the movement of troops during the Civil War. They laid the foundation for the Transcontinental Railroad, which was completed in 1869. But the price had been high. Between 1849 and 1855, an estimated 10,000 people died on the roads of the American West. Many died from causes directly related to road failure, dehydration, starvation, exposure, and accidents caused by poor design. The number was not recorded accurately because no one was counting. The dead were buried in unmarked graves along the trail. Their names are not in any official record. What investigators found later, when historians began to reconstruct the road system of the Gold Rush, was a story of incremental learning. The first roads were rough tracks that followed animal paths. The second generation of roads were graded but still vulnerable to weather. The third generation were engineered with drainage and bridges. Each step was taken only after a disaster forced the issue. The Johnson Cutoff disaster led to the Placerville-Carson Pass Road. The Sand Walking Party disaster led to the establishment of the Lowe's Angels Death Valley route, later improved by the military. The Donner Party disaster, which occurred in 1846 but was still fresh in memory, had already spurred the construction of the first Trans-Sierra Road over Donner Pass in 1849. That road was built by the Stevens-Townsend-Murphy Party survivors. They knew that if they wanted to reach California safely, they would have to build the road themselves. The road builders of the Gold Rush era were a diverse group. They were miners, merchants, soldiers, and engineers. They were Chinese laborers, African-American teamsters, Mormon immigrants, and Native American guides. They worked together under harsh conditions. They blasted rock with black powder. They moved earth with shovels and wheelbarrows. They built bridges across rivers that flooded every spring. They graded roads across desert basins where summer temperatures reached 120 degrees. They worked for wages that were low and conditions that were dangerous. Many died during construction. Their names are rarely remembered, but their roads are still there. The routes they built became the highways and interstates of the 20th century. The road system of the American West was not a product of government planning, it was a response to crisis. The crisis was the Gold Rush. The Gold Rush created an impossible demand for transportation. The first response was chaos. The second response was fraud. The third response was disaster. The fourth response was construction. The men and women who built the roads learned from each disaster. They shared their knowledge through letters, newspapers, and guidebooks. They formed associations to lobby for state funding. They petitioned Congress for military surveys. They built toll roads and charged fees to recover costs. The system that emerged was pragmatic. It was not perfect, but it worked. The legacy of these roads is visible today. Interstate 80 follows the route of the first Trans-Sierra Road over Donner Pass. US 50 follows the Carson Pass Road built by the Placerville miners. US 395 follows the route of the Military Wagon Road built by the Army Corps of Topographical Engineers. The alignment is not coincidental. The road builders of the Gold Rush chose the best routes. They found the lowest passes. They located the most reliable water sources. Their choices were based on experience, trial, and error. The errors cost lives, but the experience was preserved. What remains unanswered is the question of how many other disasters might have been prevented if the government had acted sooner. The federal government had the authority to survey roads before the Gold Rush. The Army Corps of Topographical Engineers had been mapping the West since the 1830s rose, but Congress was reluctant to fund infrastructure in the territories. The prevailing political belief was that roads should be built by private enterprise, not by the state. That belief was challenged by the scale of death. By 1855, even the most ardent advocates of laissez-faire had to admit that private enterprise had failed to produce a safe road system. The federal response was slow, but it came. The military wagon roads of the 1850s and the transcontinental railroad of the 1860s were direct results of the disasters of the Gold Rush. The story of how Gold Rush roads built the American West is not a story of triumph. It is a story of catastrophe and response. The roads were built by people who had no choice. They were built because the alternative was death, and many died anyway. But the roads that survived connected the continent. They allowed the United States to expand and to unify. They carried not only gold seekers but also settlers, farmers, and families. They carried the goods that built cities and the ideas that built a nation. The roads were crude at first, they were dangerous. They were built on faith and hope, but they were built. and the American West as we know it was built on top of them. At 8 a.m. on December 25, 1849, a group of 43 men, women, and children stood at the edge of a salt pan in the Mojave Desert. They had been walking for 3 days without a wagon, without an ox, without a map that matched the ground beneath their feet. The leader of this party was John H. Rogers, a miner from Missouri who had been told that a shortcut through the desert would cut weeks off the journey to California. The shortcut was called the Sand Walking Route. It had been advertised in newspapers and handbills as a dry, level road that avoided the rugged Sierra Nevada. It was none of those things. The party had left the main emigrant trail at the Muddy River near present-day Nevada on December 18th. The handbill promised water every 10 miles. It promised firm ground for wagons. It promised shade. By December 22nd, the wagons were stuck in soft sand. The oxen were dying. The water was gone. The party abandoned the wagons, packed what food they could carry, and set out on foot. The plan was to reach a settlement called Los Angeles, rumored to be 150 miles south. No one in the party had ever been to Los Angeles. No one knew the distance. No one had a compass. At 10 a.m. on December 26, 2 scouts, Lewis Manley and John Rogers, were sent ahead to find water. They walked east into the mountains. At 2 p.m. they found a spring. They returned to the party that night. The water was brackish but drinkable. The party rested for a day, then they resumed walking south. The terrain was endless salt flats, dry lake beds, and jagged hills. By December 30th, the party was split into 3 groups. One group had turned east, hoping to find the old Spanish Trail. Another group continued south. The third group, led by Rogers, stayed in the desert and waited for rescue. By January 1st, 1850, 2 children had died of thirst. By January 5th, 5 more adults had died. The survivors began to eat the flesh of the dead. They did not record the names of the dead. There was no time. What happened? The sand walking party was not an isolated tragedy. It was one of many such disasters that occurred on the fraudulent cutoffs of the gold rush era. The promoters of these shortcuts were often land speculators or merchants who wanted to funnel traffic through their own settlements. They published guidebooks with false distances, false water sources, and false promises. They called roads by names that sounded easy: the Sand Walking Route, the Johnson Cutoff, the Lassen Cutoff. The names hid the truth. The truth was that these roads were not roads at all. They were trails through waterless basins, over steep passes, and across terrain that had never been surveyed. The promoters did not walk those roads themselves. They relied on hearsay or maps drawn from memory. The sand walking party was particularly tragic because it was preventable. The party carried a guidebook written by a man named Thomas Farnham who had crossed the desert 5 years earlier by a different route. Farnham's map was inaccurate. He had not actually traveled the sand walking route. He had drawn it from interviews with Native Americans who he had not fully understood. The party also carried a newspaper clipping from the California Star that described the route as a smooth, dry, level road covered with gravel. The newspaper was owned by a man who wanted to promote settlement in Southern California. He had never driven a wagon across the desert. How could this have happened? Investigators later pieced together the chain of failures. First, the federal government had conducted no systematic survey of the Mojave Desert before the gold rush. The maps available to emigrants were based on the explorations of John C. Fremont in 1844, but Fremont had crossed the Sierra Nevada far to the north. His maps of the Mojave were vague. Second, there was no official agency to verify the claims of road promoters. Anyone could publish a guidebook. Anyone could call a trail a road. The term road had no legal definition. Third, the emigrants themselves were desperate to save time. The California gold fields were rumor and promise. Every day saved on the trail was a day closer to wealth. They were willing to believe the promises. The sand walking party's survivors were rescued by Mormon settlers from a colony near present-day San Bernardino. The settlers had heard rumors of a stranded party and sent out search parties with water and food. By the time the rescuers arrived, 23 members of the original party were dead. The survivors were emaciated, delirious, and covered in sores from the salt. They were taken to the Mormon colony where they were fed and clothed. Many eventually reached Los Angeles. Some returned to the desert to bury the dead. They marked the graves with piles of stones. Those stones are still there, although the names have eroded away. The response from the state of California was slow. In 1850, California was a newly admitted state, still organizing its government. The legislature did not have the resources to investigate every cutoff disaster. But the sand walking party was reported in newspapers across the state. The horror stories became public. The truth about the sand walking route was exposed. The promoter who had advertised the route was never held accountable. There was no law against false advertising on the frontier. The disaster led directly to the first state-funded road survey in Southern California. In 1851, the California legislature commissioned a survey of a route from Los Angeles to the Colorado River, the exact region where the sand walking party had perished. The survey was conducted by a team of engineers led by a man named George Darby, an officer in the Army Corps of Topographical Engineers. Darby traveled the desert on foot with a compass, a sextant, and a notebook. He mapped the water holes. He measured the distances. He recorded the grades. He marked the passes. His report was published in 1850. It was the first accurate map of the Mojave Desert corridor. Darby's map did not stop the false cutoffs overnight, but it gave the military the information they needed to establish a reliable supply route to the Colorado River. In 1854, the Army built a wagon road from Los Angeles to Fort Yuma following Darby's survey. That road became the basis for the Southern Emigrant Trail used by thousands of settlers in the 1850s. It also became the route for the Southern Pacific Railroad in the 1870s. The road saved lives, but the cost was measured in the bodies of the Sand Walking Party. The pattern repeated in other regions. In the Great Basin of what is now Utah and Nevada, the Hastings Cutoff had already claimed the Donner Party in 1846. Then came the Simpson Cutoff, the Salt Lake Cutoff, and the Hastings Cutoff variant known as the Greenwood Cutoff. Each was advertised as a shortcut. Each was a death trap. The difference was that after 1850, the government began to investigate. The Army Corps of Topographical Engineers, under the command of Captain Howard Stansbury, surveyed the Great Basin in 1849 and 1850. Stansbury mapped the shore of the Great Salt Lake, the route of the Humboldt River, and the passes through the Sierra Nevada. His maps were published in 1850. They became the standard reference for emigrants, but maps alone were not roads. The government needed to build actual roads. In 1853, Congress appropriated funds for the first federally funded wagon road in the West, the Fort Kearny South Pass-Fort Laramie Military Road. The road was built by the Army Corps of Topographical Engineers who had been surveying the region since the 1840s. The road was engineered to military standards, a minimum width of 15 feet, a grade no steeper than 5%, and a cleared right-of-way of 50 feet. It was the first road in the West that followed a surveyed alignment with bridges over streams and drainage ditches to prevent washouts. It was not a trail, it was a road. The Fort Kearny Road was completed in 1850. The cost was high both in money and in men. The construction crews included soldiers, civilian laborers, and Native American guides. They worked through blizzards, hailstorms, and prairie fires. They cut timber from the Rocky Mountains to build bridges. They blasted rock with black powder. They graded the road with shovels and horse-drawn scrapers. By the fall of 1854, the road was open. It immediately became the main route for military supplies, mail, and civilian traffic. The cost of shipping goods from the Missouri River to Fort Laramie dropped by half. The travel time from Independence, Missouri, to the California goldfields was reduced by several weeks. The success of the Fort Kearny Road led to additional federal projects. In 1855, Congress authorized a military road from Fort Leavenworth to Fort Laramie, following the Oregon Trail. In 1856, a road was built from Fort Union, New Mexico to Fort Yuma, Arizona. In 1857, the Army Corps built a road from the Columbia River to the Willamette Valley in Oregon. Each road was surveyed, engineered, and built with government funds. Each road replaced a dangerous cutoff. Each road was a direct response to the disasters of the Gulf. The question that remains unanswered is how many lives could have been saved if the federal government had built these roads earlier. The Army Corps of Topographical Engineers had the expertise. They had been mapping the West since the 1830s. They had the equipment, the personnel, and the authority, but Congress did not fund them until the death toll from the cutoffs became a political issue. The gold rush created the demand. The disasters created the pressure. The government responded, but only after thousands had died. The road builders of the 1850s were not the miners of 1849. They were professionals. They were engineers, surveyors, and soldiers. They were also immigrants, former slaves, and Native Americans. They worked for wages, not gold. They built roads that were straight, graded, and drained. They built roads that had to hold. They drilled wells at every campsite. They planted cottonwood trees along the route to provide shade. They erected signposts and distance markers. They built bridges that could withstand spring floods. The difference between a cutoff and a federal road was the difference between improvisation and planning. One of the most dramatic examples of this transformation occurred in the Sierra Nevada. The first wagon road over the Sierra was built in 1849 by the survivors of the Donner Party. They had watched friends and family die in the snow. They had eaten human flesh to survive. They were determined that no one else would suffer that fate. That road, called the Donner Pass Road, was crude. It followed the path of the Donner Party's final struggle. It was narrow, steep, and prone to avalanches. In 1852, a blizzard caught a wagon train on the pass, killing 37 people. The survivors were rescued by a group of miners from a nearby camp. The miners then built a new road called the Snowshoe Road that bypassed the worst of the pass. They blasted ledges out of the granite. They built a wooden snowshed to protect travelers from avalanches. They charged a toll of $1 per wagon. The road was opened by the fall of 1850. The Snowshoe Road was an improvement, but it was still dangerous. In 1854, the California legislature chartered a company to build a permanent road over the Sierra. The company was called the Placerville and Carson Valley Turnpike Company. It was funded by private investment, but it was overseen by a state commissioner. The company hired a surveyor named S.B. Lucky to design the road. Lucky spent 6 months in the field, climbing every ridge, measuring every grade, testing every soil type. He chose a route that followed the Carson River, crossed the crest at a saddle called Kit Carson Pass, and descended into the Sacramento Valley. The road was built in 1855. It was 20 feet wide with a gentle gradient of 4%. It had stone culverts, wooden bridges, and a toll station at the summit. The road was an immediate success. Within a year, it carried more than 50,000 wagons. The Carson Pass Road was not built by a miner or a speculator. It was built by a professional surveyor working for a chartered company using government-approved maps and public funding. It was built because the disasters of the Sand Walking Party, the Johnson Cutoff, and the Donner Party had made it politically impossible to leave road building to private enterprise. The state and federal governments had learned that the cost of inaction was higher than the cost of intervention, but the lessons were not applied evenly. In the desert regions, the federal road building program was slower. The Mojave Road, built by the military in the 1860s, was still a gravel track. The Colorado River crossing at Yuma was dangerous until a steamship service began in 1858. The Great Basin remained a zone of peril until the Transcontinental Railroad was completed in 1869. The railroad solved the transportation problem for passengers and freight, but it did not solve the problem of local roads. The counties and territories were left to maintain the wagon roads that remained. The Gold Rush road system was a patchwork. It was built by private companies, by state governments, by the federal military, and by volunteer groups. It was built in haste. It was built with limited resources. It was built in terrain that had never been mapped. The engineers of the time worked with the best tools they had: compasses, barometers, and chain surveys. They calculated grades by hand. They designed bridges without stress analysis. They made mistakes. Some bridges collapsed, some roads washed out, some routes were abandoned, but the engineering knowledge accumulated. The Corps of Topographical Engineers published their surveys in professional journals. The data was shared across the country. By the time the Civil War began in 1861, the United States had a comprehensive set of maps and road profiles for the western half of the continent. The human cost of this knowledge was staggering. Between 1849 and 1860, an estimated 20,000 people died on the roads of the American West. The deaths were not evenly distributed. The cutoffs accounted for a disproportionate number of fatalities. The main emigrant trails, like the Oregon Trail and the California Trail, were relatively safe if followed strictly. But the pressure to save time, to avoid competition, to follow the advice of a friend or a newspaper led thousands to deviate. The deviations were almost always disastrous. The investigators of the 20th century, historians and archaeologists, studied these disasters through diaries, letters, and physical remains. They found that the deaths were not random. They clustered around specific geographic features: dry lake beds, steep passes, river crossings. The families who perished on the sand walking route were not poor or ignorant. They were middle-class farmers and merchants who had bought land in California through a land office. They had read the guidebooks. They had hired a guide who claimed to know the trail. The guide abandoned them on the second day when he realized his mistake. The system had failed them at every level. There was no licensing for guides. There was no requirement to file a map with a government office. There was no inspection of toll roads. A man could build a road across a mountain pass with no engineering, no drainage, no safety features. He could collect tolls for 10 years and then abandon the road when it became impassable. The state of California did not create a highway commission until 1895. By that time, the gold rush was over, but the roads it had built endured. The legacy of the gold rush roads is both physical and cultural. The routes they pioneered became the alignments for the interstate highways of the 20th century. The towns they supplied became cities. The water sources they marked became reservoirs. The passes they identified became national park boundaries. The stories of the disasters became cautionary tales in American folklore. The Donner Party, the Sand Walking Party, the Johnson Cutoff, these names are still taught in schools. They are not taught as engineering failures. They are taught as human tragedies. But they were engineering failures. The roads that killed people were not designed well enough. The roads that saved people were designed by professionals who learned from the failures. The unanswered question is whether the federal government could have done more sooner. The Army Corps of Topographical Engineers had the authority to survey roads in the territories as early as the Indian Removal Act of 1830. They had the resources, but the political will was absent. The ideology of the time favored private enterprise. The disasters of the gold rush challenged that ideology but did not overturn it. The government did not take direct control of road building until the 1850s, and even then it was limited to military roads. The Transcontinental Railroad was a private enterprise subsidized by land grants. The wagon roads that connected to the railroad were built by counties and towns. The system was fragmented, Yet the roads were built. The American West was connected. The gold that came out of California in the first 5 years of the rush was worth $500 million. The roads that carried that gold were built by men who had never built a road before. They learned by dying. The roads they built are still there, under the asphalt, under the concrete, under the gravel. They are the bones of the West. On May 18, 1857, Captain James H. Simpson of the U.S. Army Corps of Topographical Engineers received written orders from the War Department in Washington. He was to lead a surveying expedition from Salt Lake City to the Mojave River in Southern California. His mission: find a direct wagon road across the Great Basin. The existing route, the Old Spanish Trail, was long and dangerous. The new road was intended to shorten the journey by 200 miles. Simpson assembled a team of 40 men, engineers, chainmen, packers, and a military escort. They departed on June 1, 1857. The first day went well. They crossed the Jordan River and entered the desert. By the third day, they had lost their first mule to a rattlesnake bite. At 7:30 a.m. on June 15, 1857, the expedition reached the summit of a ridge they named Cedar Pass. Simpson recorded an elevation of 6,800 feet. Below them stretched an endless basin of sagebrush and salt flats. The road would have to cross that basin. Simpson spent the next 3 weeks surveying the terrain. He found water sources, graded passes, and marked the route with stone cairns. He noted the soil condition, the slope angles, the availability of wood. His journal entries are clinical and precise. On July 4, 1857, the expedition crossed a dry lake bed. The temperature reached 115 degrees. 2 men collapsed from heat exhaustion. They were revived with water from a canteen. The road was mapped. The survey was completed on August 12, 1857. Simpson returned to Salt Lake City and submitted his report to the War Department. He recommended a specific alignment that avoided the worst of the desert. He recommended building wells every 30 miles. He recommended a toll system to fund maintenance. The report was accepted. The road was built by a private contractor in 18 Fivite. It was called the Mormon Road because it passed through Mormon settlements. It was used by emigrants heading to California, but within 2 years the route was largely abandoned. The Civil War diverted military resources. The tolls were not collected. The road fell into disrepair. By 1865, it was impassable. What happened? The Mormon Road was a victim of timing. It was built at the exact moment that the Transcontinental Railroad was being planned. The railroad would make wagon roads obsolete for long-distance travel. The federal government lost interest in funding wagon roads once the railroad was approved. Simpson's careful survey, his water sources, his graded passes were all rendered irrelevant by the iron rails. The road was used for local traffic, but it never became the national highway Simpson envisioned. The system had failed to coordinate. The War Department approved the road, but Congress did not appropriate funds for maintenance. The contractor cut corners. The wells were never dug. Investigators of the 20th century, studying Simpson's journals and the surviving road traces, found a pattern of missed opportunities. Simpson had identified the best route across the Great Basin. He had mapped water sources that were later used by the railroad, but the government did not act on his recommendations for permanent improvements. The road was built as a temporary track, not a permanent highway. The materials were cheap. The grading was minimal. The road washed out in the first heavy rain. The human consequences were indirect. Without a reliable wagon road, emigrants continued to use the Old Spanish Trail. That trail had its own disasters. In 1858, a party of 30 lost their way on the Old Spanish Trail and perished in the desert. 9 bodies were found by a rescue party 2 months later. The survivors reported that they had tried to follow Simpson's route but could not find it. The markers had been removed by travelers looking for firewood. The road had vanished. The question of why the road was not maintained is tied to the broader failure of the federal government to take responsibility for Western infrastructure. The gold rush had shown that private roads could be built quickly, but they were rarely maintained. The government-built roads, like Simpson's survey, were designed for long-term use, but they were underfunded. The middle ground, a public-private partnership with oversight, was tried in California with the Placerville and Carson Valley Turnpike. That road survived. But for every successful turnpike, there were 5 roads that collapsed. The legacy of Simpson's survey is indirect. His maps were used by the Union Pacific Railroad when they laid track across the Great Basin in 1869. His water sources were developed into railroad stations. The road he surveyed became the basis for U.S. Highway 91, which later became Interstate 15. The bones of the Mormon Road are still there under the asphalt, in the culverts, in the graded cuts through the ridges. But the road itself, as a functioning route, lasted only a decade. The pattern repeated across the West. In 1859, the federal government funded a road from Fort Benton, Montana, to Walla Walla, Washington. It was built by the Army Corps of Engineers. The road was well designed with stone bridges and graded slopes. It was used for a decade, then abandoned when the railroad arrived. In 1861, the government built a road from Fort Kearny to Fort Laramie. It was built to supply military outposts. It was never open to civilian traffic. The roads were built for specific purposes and those purposes expired. The gold rush had created a brief window of intense demand for roads. That window closed when the railroad arrived. But the roads that were built in that window left a permanent imprint. They defined the corridors that later highways would follow. They taught engineers how to build in difficult terrain. They taught government officials that roads needed maintenance, not just construction. The failures were as important as the successes. On March 3, 1863, Congress passed the Pacific Railroad Act. The act authorized the construction of a transcontinental railroad. The wagon roads were no longer a national priority, but the roads had already done their work. They had moved the gold. They had opened the West to settlement. They had connected California to the rest of the country. The roads were crude, dangerous, and poorly maintained, but they were the only option. The men who built them were not professionals. They were miners, farmers, and merchants who needed a way to move goods. They built roads with picks, shovels, and blasting powder. They built roads that killed people. They built roads that saved people. The human cost of these roads is still being measured. In 1995, a historian named John D. Unruh published a study of emigrant deaths on the California Trail. He estimated that between 1841 and 1869, at least 45,000 people died on the trail. Most of them died from disease, not accidents, but a significant number died from dehydration, starvation, and exposure. These deaths were preventable. They were caused by poor road design, bad maps, and misleading guidebooks. The system of information sharing was inadequate. The government did not publish accurate maps until the 1850s. By then, thousands had already died. The unanswered question is whether the government could have acted sooner. The Army Corps of Topographical Engineers had the expertise. They had the authority to survey roads in the territories as early as the 1830s, but they were underfunded and understaffed. The gold rush created a crisis that forced the government to act, but the action was reactive, not proactive. The roads were built after the disasters, not before. The Sand Walking Party, the Johnson Cutoff, the Donner Party, the blizzard on the Snowshoe Road, the deaths on the Old Spanish Trail, each disaster prompted a new road, a new survey, a new regulation. The system learned by failure. In 1866, the California legislature passed a law requiring all toll roads to be inspected by a county surveyor. The law was a direct response to a collapse of a toll bridge on the Yuba River that killed 12 people. The bridge had been built by a private company without any engineering oversight. The county surveyor found that the bridge used undersized timbers. The company was fined and the bridge was rebuilt. The law was a small step, but it set a precedent. Road building was no longer a free-for-all. By the 1870s, the state of California had a network of inspected toll roads. The roads were built to higher standards. The grades were gentler, the bridges were stronger, the mortality rate on the roads dropped. But the cost of building these roads was passed to the users. Tolls were high, farmers complained. The roads were still a private enterprise, but with public oversight. The tension between private profit and public safety would continue into the 20th century. The story of the Gold Rush roads is not a story of triumph. It is a story of necessity. The roads were built because they had to be built. The gold was in California. The people were in the East. The only way to get from one to the other was to cross a continent. The roads were the threads that stitched the country together. They were crude, dangerous, and expensive, but they worked. The roads are still there. They are the bones of the West. Beneath the interstates, beneath the county highways, beneath the gravel tracks, the routes surveyed by Captain Simpson, by S.B. Lucky, by the toll road companies, by the Army Corps of Engineers are still in use. The gradients are still there. The passes are still there. The water sources are still there. The roads have been rebuilt, widened, paved, and straightened. But the alignment is the same. The 19th century surveyors chose the routes that made sense. Modern engineers have not improved on them, they have only paved over them. The final chapter of the Gold Rush roads came in 1912 when the Lincoln Highway Association was formed. The association promoted a transcontinental road from New York to San Francisco. The route followed the old emigrant trails through the Sierra Nevada. It used the Donner Pass, the same pass that had killed the Donner Party 70 years earlier. The road was paved in the 1920s. It became U.S. Highway 40. In the 1960s, it became Interstate 80. The road that killed the Donner Party is now a 6-lane highway. The snowsheds are gone, the toll stations are gone, but the road is still there. The Gold Rush roads built the American West not because they were well built, but because they were built at all. They were built by men who did not know what they were doing. They learned by dying. The knowledge they accumulated became the foundation of American civil engineering. The roads they built became the spines of cities. The legacy is not in the gold, but in the roads. The roads are still moving people. They are still connecting places. They are still the bones. On July 25, 1916, the Federal Aid Road Act was signed into law by President Woodrow Wilson. The act appropriated $75 million to be distributed to states for highway construction over 5 years. It required states to have a highway department to match federal funds and to follow engineering standards. It was the first major federal investment in roads since the 1860s. The act was a direct response to the failures of the gold rush era. The private roads had been built without standards, the government roads had been underfunded, the toll roads had been predatory, the deaths had been preventable. The 1916 Act aimed to professionalize road building, but the act came 50 years too late for the thousands who had died on the wagon roads. It came 60 years after the Sand Walking Party had perished in the desert. It came 70 years after the Donner Party had resorted to cannibalism in the snow. The lessons of those disasters were finally codified into law. The question that remains is why it took so long. The answer lies in the nature of American governance in the 19th century. The federal government had limited authority over roads in the territories. The Constitution gave states control over internal improvements. The territories had weak governments. The Army Corps of Topographical Engineers could survey but not build. The private sector built the roads but with no oversight. The system was decentralized, underfunded, and reactive. Only a catastrophe could force change. The 1916 Act was not a reaction to a single disaster, but to a century of accumulated failure. In 1921, the Federal Highway Act increased funding to $200 million. The states began building a numbered highway system. In 1926, U.S. Route 66 was designated, linking Chicago to Los Angeles. Its route through the Southwest followed the old mail routes, the Mormon Road and the Gold Rush Trails. In 1936, the Pan American Highway was proposed, connecting the Americas. The Gold Rush roads had shown that long-distance routes were possible but expensive. The federal highway system proved that centralized funding and engineering standards could produce roads that lasted. How did the Gold Rush roads influence modern highway engineering? The surveyors of the 1850s had identified the best passes, the safest river crossings, the most reliable water sources. Modern engineers used those same alignments. Interstate 80 through the Sierra Nevada follows the route of the 1852 Snowshoe Road. Interstate 15 through the Great Basin follows the Mormon Road surveyed by Captain Simpson. Interstate 5 through the Central Valley follows the route of the 1849 Stockton-Los Angeles Road. The grades are gentler, the curves are wider, the pavement is smoother. But the path is the same. The human cost of the Gold Rush roads also shaped modern safety regulations. The 1866 California Toll Road Inspection Law became a model for state highway departments. The 1916 Federal Aid Road Act required states to adopt standard bridge designs and load limits. The 193s saw the introduction of guardrails, centerline markings, and warning signs. These measures were invented because the wagon roads had killed too many people. The Gold Rush had forced innovation in tragedy. On January 17, 1937, a bus carrying 40 passengers slid off an icy section of the Ridge Route in Southern California. The Ridge Route was a famous Gold Rush road that had been paved in the 190s. The bus fell 200 feet into a canyon. 32 people died. The crash was the deadliest in California history at the time. Investigators found that the road had no guardrails, no warning signs, and no sand barrels. The county had not maintained the road after the state took over. The disaster led to the creation of the California Highway Patrol and mandatory road inspections. The Gold Rush Road had killed again, but this time the death toll forced a statewide response. The legacy of the Gold Rush roads extends beyond engineering and safety. They shaped the settlement patterns of the West. Towns that grew along the wagon roads became cities. Sacramento, Stockton, Los Angeles, Salt Lake City, Denver, Portland, Seattle, all were founded or expanded because of the Gold Rush traffic. The roads determined where the railroads were built. The railroads determined where the highways were built. The highways determined where the suburbs were built. The bones of the West are still visible in the urban grid. What happened to the men who built the roads? Most of them died poor. The toll road investors made money, but they lost it in the 1855 Depression. The surveyors like Captain Simpson returned to the Army and served in the Civil War. Simpson was promoted to brigadier general and later commanded the Department of the Platte. He died in 1884, a respected engineer. S.B. Lucky, the man who discovered Carson Pass, disappeared from historical records. He died in obscurity in the 1860s. The miners who built the first roads were forgotten. Their names appear in no history books, but their work remains. The roads themselves were eventually paved over. The toll stations were dismantled. The signposts rotted away. The graves of those who died along the trails were lost. In 1956, the Interstate Highway Act was signed, creating a 41,000-mile network of controlled access highways. The act was the culmination of a century of road building that began with the Gold Rush. The interstates followed the same corridors, the same passes, the same river crossings, the same water sources. The old wagon roads are now buried under concrete and asphalt, but if you know where to look, you can still see them. In 1992, a team of archaeologists surveyed a section of the Mormon Road in Utah. They found wagon ruts still visible in the desert floor. They found campfire rings, broken bottles, and the remains of a stagecoach station. The road had been abandoned in 1869 when the railroad arrived, but the desert had preserved it. The ruts were as clear as the day they were cut. The archaeologists traced them for miles. The road was not a single track but a braided network. Wagons had chosen different paths to avoid mud, rocks, and deep sand. The road was alive, changing with each season. The Gold Rush roads built the American West not through grand design but through desperation. They were built by men who needed to move gold, supplies, and people. They were built with minimal tools and maximum effort. They killed thousands. They saved thousands. They connected a continent. The roads are still there. They are the bones. The interstates are the flesh. And the Gold Rush is the memory.